We commemorate the 69 lives lost in Sharpeville on this day back in 1960 when police opened fire on people demonstrating peacefully against the restrictive apartheid pass laws. Let's now speak to veteran journalist David O'Sullivan on the significance of this day 62 years ago and the role it plays today in a democratic South Africa. David, good to have you as always. Good morning to you and of course happy Human Rights Day to you. The significance of this day, probably a bit of context as to why this day should never be forgotten.
Tumelo, it's such an important day because it is the anniversary of one of the most calamitous, tragic days in South African history. As you pointed out, it is the murder of 69 people, the wounding of over 180 more by apartheid armed forces against a largely unarmed crowd of people. I say largely unarmed because there will be dispute about whether a couple of people were armed in some way with a stick, a stone, for example, or even if somebody had a handgun. But that aside, it is important for us to remember these significant events in our history. It changed the shape of our political discourse. The ANC and PAC were promptly banned, and that put them on a new course of opposition to the apartheid regime. It had always been passive resistance up until then, and after the Sharpeville massacre, so it turned quite fundamentally into a position of armed resistance.
Right, David, but 69 is not just a number, right? These were human beings, people's lives, and they had names. You acknowledge that these are some of the unsung heroes, that no school, no streets, no acknowledgement of them has been named. One particular hero that you sing, his name is Nyakane Tsolo. Why is it important for you to actually name them, say their names and acknowledge, their names and the role they played in this day?
Well, I'm glad that you singled out Nyakane Tsolo because he certainly seems to have been airbrushed from history. On the anniversary, the 60th anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre, I went to Sharpeville and I interviewed a number of survivors of the massacre. And all of them paid tribute to Nyakane Tsolo. And I became quite intrigued by this man, who unfortunately had passed away only a few years earlier. He was about 19 or 20 years old at the time. He had very little education, a grade 10 at best. He was a trade unionist, and he became a member of the Pan-Africanist movement in Sharpeville. And he showed a natural propensity for organizing a crowd, and it fell quite naturally on his shoulders to be the person who negotiated with the police. So on the morning, around about this time as we're chatting now, on the 62nd anniversary, he and his colleagues from the PAC were walking up and down the streets of Sharpeville, blowing whistles to tell everybody to come out with their passbooks and gather outside the police station, where they were demanding to be arrested. The police station's very small, a crowd of about 2,000 people had gathered, and the police turned them away. As he pointed out much later, if they'd just arrested him and a couple of the other leaders, the crowd would have dispersed and there would have been no significant event that day. It would have just gone, the day would have just gone on. However, the crowd built up, the police refused to arrest them, and finally it came to a confrontation at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon where Nyakane Tsolo, after 3 or 4 times trying to negotiate with the police, was finally arrested in a fit of pique by a man called Colonel Spengler, who is one of the most notorious of thugs from the apartheid era, a man who should have gone on trial if that was at all possible. And at that moment, the crowd surged forward against the fence of the police station, and then a fracas broke out, which prompted the police to open fire. One of the colonels, I think it's a Colonel Fenter, he was insistent that the police standing at that police station should shoot into the crowd. And that is what happened, and 69 people were killed. But Nyakane Tsolo, this brave youngster who said, arrest me, and then the people will disperse, who negotiated so fervently to try and appease the situation, to calm the situation, he's not properly acknowledged for the significant role that he played.
Speaking of acknowledgement, David, does naming today Human Rights Day water down on that significance that you just told us about. Nyakane, Tsolo, the many 2,000, if not 3,000 protesters peacefully marching to the police station, trying to, of course, almost, fight against these restrictive pass laws. Does the word Human Rights Day water down those efforts, those stories, those unsung heroes?
I'm in two minds about this, and Prof. Maluleke makes a very good point.
Yeah.
I feel that Sharpeville Day and the events of Sharpeville should be commemorated each and every time. I think the center of our attention should be on Sharpeville every 21st of March. I wonder, though, if the idea of calling it Human Rights Day isn't a bad one simply because we are able to reflect on a bigger issue. These people obviously were protesting against a lack of human rights, the lack of freedom of movement.
Right.
Their human rights were so badly violated, so tragically, so viciously violated that day, that possibly it is a good opportunity for us to reflect on the issue of human rights. I also feel that we miss the opportunity to reflect not only on our human rights, but also our obligations that come with those rights, that we don't actually get educated, people don't get educated about where you even find the Bill of Rights. Have people even read the Bill of Rights and understood its rights and obligations? But I do feel that the attention is taken off a significant political event in South Africa, and there is too often the unfinished business that is not attended to. And I worry that we don't ever confront the problems of the past, address them adequately. I have spoken to so many of the aging survivors, and each year I'll find one of them has passed away. So these people who went through this awful tragedy are dying without ever feeling a sense of closure. I interviewed last year a woman who lost her father, and the memory is as raw now as it was then. People have not had compensation for what has happened. And on the occasion of the 60th anniversary 2 years ago, when I was standing outside what was the police station, it's now a community hall, there was a meeting going on inside by the Kulumani support group, which does so much to fight for the rights of people who have been so badly affected by the evils of apartheid. And I find it amazing that 60 years later, this is still an issue. And the irony of the meeting to help the survivors and families of those who were shot dead was taking place in the very building where the police stood and opened fire. But nothing has been done, and the wounds are still very raw for a lot of the people, the old people and the descendants of those who died in Sharpeville.
Absolutely, David. In essence, people haven't healed. People have not yet healed. All right, David, we'll have to leave it there due to time, but I appreciate you speaking to me this morning. David O'Sullivan, of course, veteran journalist, taking us back to 1960, but also putting names to some of the unsung heroes that played quite a significant role back in 1916, of course, fighting against restrictive pass laws back in the day in Sharpeville. We'll have